I am making this video because I have to. When I cover a deck, I like to cover the strong points on it, but also the weak points on it in its 101 series. So today we are talking about how to counter Noble Knights. Hey, it's me, Saul, and I get it. This video it would be a lot more relevant if Noble Knights were still the tier 1 deck, but as we've covered in this series, they still have all of that potential, all of that power within the archetype if you're able to get it to run smoothly and consistently. So for this video, the assumption will be that you are up against a Noble Knight player who has opened optimally, built their deck optimally, and has their optimal strategies on board. Now, despite what some people might lead you to believe, Noble Knights are still a relatively strong deck, I'll be completely honest with you. It's not the easiest thing in the world to counter them. There are some strategies and some plays though that I'll go over that can kind of back them into a corner or pinch some of their plays in a way that might lead you to victory, right? The deck is strong enough to play through them sometimes, like I said, if they've opened optimally, but let's get into it. The very first and most obvious thing to talk about is inconsistency. Now, like I said at the beginning, and probably more than that, the deck is somewhat inconsistent in its current state. The ban list change that hit them, it didn't actually hit them, it hit the skill that they were using, balance, which no longer allows them to guarantee their starting hand and all of that. And as I've talked about earlier in the series, that makes it so that it's very difficult with such a large core to open in the right way. So if they've opened the way that they want to and they have that hand that they need, inconsistency isn't that much of a problem then, is it? Well, they still have to contend with their draw phase every single turn. Now, if they've built their deck optimally, they should be getting good draws, but they might not be able to exert as much pressure as they would like to, and because different people will build their decks in different ways, they might not have that consistency. They might not run the trap card at 3 the way that I do, which means that you only have to worry about 2 of the traps, or when they activate Boars' effect, they're not guaranteed to get that turn 2 floating effect. So watch their graveyard, see what they send with Boars, see what they open on, see what they choose to summon using the trap card, using Madrat, using Merlin, and you know, gain a basis for what you're dealing with. Inconsistency will be a problem for even the best Noble Knight player, but as a rule of thumb, always assume that your opponent has opened optimally unless they prove otherwise, right? Unless they show you that they have, you know, not got what they need in hand, assume that they do. Now, assuming that you're up against a Noble Knight player who has the hand of God watching over them and inconsistency isn't an issue, one of the first things that you'd want to consider is going first is great. You'd be able to set up your disruption and mess up their opening turn. However, you cannot rely on going first because it's a 50-50 chance. If you do go first though, make sure you think about effect negation. You know, a turn 1 bouncer would be nice, a turn 1 Arvada, a light imprisoning mirror, type beat kind of stuff. But one thing that I want to make sure that you're aware of is do not use Fiendish Chain. If you're trying to use Fiendish Chain, then okay, fine, you can use it, but don't use it on Merlin. Merlin, as a cost for its effect, will tribute itself and be sent to the graveyard. You cannot Fiendish Chain to stop Merlin. Once Merlin summons a monster such as Madrat, then you can use your Fiendish Chain. Do not use it before. But a Karma Cut will do, you know, basically the same thing. It'll get the monster off the field so you don't have to deal with it, which is really, really nice. Think about other types of disruption and removal. Like I said, Karma Cut, Book of Moon is also nice to stop their opening plays. If they're flip face down, then the equip cards can't equip onto them. They also can't float onto them. And any equip cards that are currently there just fall off, which is, you know, that's their whole deal. You also want to think about graveyard negation such as Necro Valley to prevent the Merlin from activating from the graveyard, to prevent the equip spells from floating back onto the monsters, and to prevent the trap card from activating to summon a monster. The deck isn't completely reliant on the graveyard. It still has a degree of strong effects that it can use without the graveyard. For instance, Cussin, it can still bounce cards, Madrat can still special summon, Boars can still draw 1 even though the 2 that get sent to the graveyard aren't useful, Artorigus can still destroy monsters, Dristan can still destroy cards. The deck is quite proficient without the use of its graveyard, but it hinders them in a way, and that hindrance might be what you need to get ahead. As a quick side note, if you're watching this as someone who plays the Noble Knight deck, look at these things that I'm saying and see what you can do to work around them. Some of them you might not be able to because that's just the way the cookie crumbles. That's just life. That's just the way the deck and the game state is. But some of them you might be able to keep in mind to help yourself out, you know, to be a bit more cautious, to see if your opponent is watching out for these things. The next thing I would like to talk about is the trap card, Until Noble Arms Are Needed Once Again. Now, this card is great for floating, and you go +1 using the card because you're able to draw one. However, one thing that can put a Noble Knight player at a disadvantage is they have to reveal whatever card they're drawing, right? So they're going +1, but they have just revealed to you what they've added to your hand. So imagine a situation where you are going second, your opponent activates a card because they've gone first, and they show you that they just added a Karma Cut to their hand. Well, now you know to play around a Karma Cut. Not the strongest disadvantage, and I mean, they've still gotten to go +1, they still got the Karma Cut, but that knowledge, sometimes knowledge is power in this game, and the knowledge that you need to play around a Karma Cut can sometimes invalidate the Karma Cut. So yeah, this can be made even worse actually if they have if the Noble Knight player has 2 equipped spells on the field and activates Until Noble Arms Are Needed Once Again, they reveal the top 2 cards of their deck. So not only do you see what they just added to their hand, but you can see what they're about to add to their hand as well, which is literally just a benefit to you. They get to choose which of the cards that they want, but so long as their deck isn't shuffled again, you know exactly what's in their hand. As a Noble Knight player, if you're trying to work around this, what I now do is, as much as physically possible, I try to only activate the trap card on the field when I've got 1 equipped spell on the field. That way I only have to reveal 1 card rather than 2, or I activate the trap card in the graveyard after I've revealed 2 cards. That way my deck gets shuffled. So that's the counter to the counter. But then if someone hasn't seen this video and they don't know to reshuffle their deck, or they just, you know, reveal 2 cards and then have at it, well, that's the initial counter still applies. Leave me alone. Still on the subject of the trap card, but a different aspect of it, something to consider when going up against Noble Knights is monster spam. And also as a Noble Knight player, consider monster spam. Now, if the duel goes on for long enough, then the opponent Noble Knight player, they might no longer have access to the right cards in the deck to float into using the trap card, right? So you can keep an eye on this. You can watch what they've used. You can see what's at their disposal, and you can maybe even disrupt them in a particular way to prevent them from being able to use a trap in the way that they want to. For instance, they can only summon monsters that have not been put in play or that are not in the graveyard currently. So if you see a Dristan in the graveyard, you know you're safe from a Dristan disruption on your turn. If you see Madrot or Boars in the graveyard, you know that they can't special summon that, so on and so forth. So you can basically watch as this card becomes a dead card in the graveyard, unless your opponent has access to Noble Knight Brothers, but you can, Noble Knight Brothers' effect to recycle cards back into the deck is not in, they have to activate it on the field, so you can disrupt Brothers before they're able to recycle their cards, meaning that they won't be able to activate their trap card to get more floating done. So you've limited their floating potential, or you've watched as they've limited it themselves, and you know to make your plays based on how they've limited themselves. Do you get what I mean? It's basically just watch their hands, watch their graveyard, watch their field, keep track of what's in play and what's not in play. That way you can limit in your mind what cards could potentially come out of the deck to disrupt you. This is a weakness that they have, right? Like the trap card is limited to only summon monsters that aren't on the field or in the graveyard, but they only really feel it if you put pressure on them and exploit it. Speaking of pressure, that takes us to the next weakness of the deck. I would say that this is one that not every deck can exploit, but let me explain. I would call this the floating dance versus pressure, right? If you know what you're doing against Noble Knights, you can actually dance around their floating effects, right? Let's say you're using a monster that can attack multiple times. In the case that I generally tended to find myself, I would use Bugente Susano, but something like a Purgatrio and other cards in the game also have this effect, where they can attack multiple monsters per turn. Well, you can effectively, well, not negate the floating, but make it redundant by using just a simple strat, just attack them in the order that they don't want you to attack them in. If a Noble Knight monster is equipped with an equip spell and you want that equip spell to float onto a different monster, that monster has to already be on the field when the first monster is removed, which means if you attack into a Noble Knight monster, they have to activate the trap card to special summon a monster from the deck right then and there before the attack goes through. So redirect the attack onto the monster that they just summoned, but because you can attack multiple times per turn, take out the monster that you still wanted to take out. In an instance where Artorigus floats, take out the monster that Artorigus floats into and you're good to go. In an instance where Cussinin floats into Artorigus and so on and so forth, just keep on taking out all of the monsters and you can effectively field wipe them depending on how many attacks you have access to in a given turn. Not every deck can make use of this weakness. This is more one because I use decks that are able to do it. It's one that I've personally encountered, but it works, so I figured I'd add it to the list. Don't let the equip spells float onto monsters that will give them additional effects. For instance, don't let them summon a Dristin onto the field and then destroy a monster with an equip spell, because that equip spell will just float onto the Dristin and pop your monster. So be strategic with how you attack, but not just with how you attack actually, but also with how you deal with monsters. For instance, let's say you want to banish something with a Karma Cut. Well, make sure that you're ready to deal with the monster that is going to gain that equip spell once the first monster leaves the field, right? Apply that pressure to them, but be careful of how they float. Moving on, speaking of the floating, another weakness, well, it's not a weakness, it's more of a balancing mechanic of the cards, is every single card in the deck can only float once per turn. If you can push past that once per turn limit, then you are absolutely good to make plays, right? Let's say you've seen them equip Destiny once from the graveyard onto a different monster. Let's say they floated once, that Destiny isn't going to come back, right? So it makes more sense. Let's say you have a targeted effect. Destroy the Destiny on the field, let it float back onto the monster. That monster will not be able to come back. So if you're able to remove the monster or remove the Destiny again, then that's it. Destiny cannot float onto a different monster. You can make your plays once you've gotten rid of Destiny. Something to also consider is Gwynnefer. She cannot float on your turn. She's an activated effect, right? She has to be activated by your opponent on their turn to equip herself from the graveyard. So if Gwynnefer is one of the cards on the field, keep in mind, she will not be able to float. But keep in mind also that if she is in play, she will always be in the game unless you're able to banish her, because she will keep on coming back from the graveyard on their turn. So keep her in mind, but know that she doesn't float. So you can potentially go in for lethal if you're able to deal with a different equip card and Gwynnefer is all that's left. I've mentioned removal a lot in this video, and I've been saying removal rather than destruction because all of the XYZ monsters within the archetype, except, well, one, and no one cares about him, they all float effectively. So if you destroy them, they'll just change into a different monster and potentially gain a different benefit or advantage. So it's better to just remove them. Don't give them the ability to float. Use a Malevolent Sin, use a Karma Cut, use anything or everything to prevent them from floating. Like I said, Graveyard Negation works too, because they would have to activate the effect from the graveyard in order to float, and just prevent that floating dance. But non-destruction removal is the best way to go against a Noble Knight deck. There's just a few more general things that I want to talk about. Don't play into a Noble Knight player without a plan or without reading the cards. Keep track of the cards, keep track of how many times each card has floated in a turn, keep track of just everything. Know where everything is. And for the love of God, please do not play directly into them. I've had so many instances where I'll have a Cussiner on the field with like an equip spell and someone's like, oh, I can't destroy that monster. Well, I've got you, I'll just send it back to the hand, and they bounce my Cussiner back to the hand so I can't float, but I just activate the trap card from the graveyard, summon a Dristin, the equip spell on my Cussiner falls off, slaps onto the Dristin, and boom, their dragon is gone and they scoop, right? So don't play into them and read the effects, know what you're doing, keep track of the floating, and try and take them out as quickly as you can, because they're at their weakest when they're just getting started. They're very weak turn one when they're just setting up, so if you can interrupt that, that's perfect. Later in the game, they just get stronger and stronger as they amass more resources, cards in the graveyard, cards on the field, all that good stuff. They're very good at setting up very fast, so you need to try and act fast if you can, or else you're gonna have to play through them. The very last thing I guess I would say is interact with them a lot, right? The opening play for Noble Knights takes a little bit, not a little bit, it takes a while, I'll be honest with you, and some of the follow-up plays also do take some time, and they take quite a bit of thought. I have timed out more times than I'd like to admit with this deck, so put pressure on them, interact with them, make them think, pass priority back to them, and put them in the hot seat. Do not slow play. I'm not telling you to play slowly intentionally. I'm telling you to keep them on their toes, right? Keep them on their toes, interact with them as much as possible, and give them more opportunities to think, because while it's an opportunity to think, it forces them to think fast. They might make a mistake. They might end up being lower on time as a result of that. I don't know if that's the best tip in the world, but based on how many times I've timed out as a Noble Knight player, I thought I would put that out there. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video somewhat helpful. If Noble Knights have been annoying you, or if you're a Noble Knight player and you're looking for the weaknesses of the deck currently to see if you can potentially counter them, hopefully I've given you something to think about, right? Please like the video if you did enjoy it. Consider subscribing to see me cover more of the Noble Knight archetype and other decks after I'm done with that. Thank you so much for your time, and bye.